Welcome in, everybody, to the CFB Nation All-America podcast. I'm Bill Trocchi, senior editor at sportingnews.com, alongside Bill Bender, our national college football writer at sportingnews.com and president of the Football Writers Association of America. Last week, we had the former FWAA president on, Andrea Adelson from ESPN. This week, we welcome in Stewart Mandel, editor-in-chief of The Athletic, co-host of the Audible podcast with Bruce Feldman. Stu, thanks for hopping in today. We got some things to discuss cooking down in New Orleans.
We do. Thanks for having me, guys.
No problem. No problem. So before we get into it, as we start every show, it's with the Trocchi trivia question. Last week we had a dramatic finish between Andrea and Bill. So this week we'll ask the question, then we revisit it at the end of the show and see who can come out on top between the two of you. The Trocchi trivia question for this week is in honor of the potential proposal to turn the SEC championship game into SEC championship weekend, where the top two teams would play, et cetera, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5, or whatever. My trivia question to both of you for the end of the show: can you name the 6 SEC teams that tied for 4th place last season?
So well, I had that in my column. I hope I can remember.
Could be part of our weekend now in December, is breaking 6-way ties for 4th. If things carry out the way they do, the way the SEC and the Big Ten potentially want. So let's get into this. Stu, you kicked off a column this week writing about the potential proposals to the college football playoff. The SEC and the Big Ten are meeting to discuss strategies, which they will kind of present to the rest of the conferences next week in Dallas. And you had this to say, that the two indisputable ruling parties are controlling the sport, the Big Ten and the SEC, and they're about to light the whole thing aflame. Now, what went into that sentence? And then what has been sort of the feedback that you've gotten?
Ever since the ESPN, ever since they kind of ratified their new deal with ESPN last year around this time, in which the Big Ten and SEC strong-armed everybody into allowing them to have the unilateral ability to change the format, they've wasted no time. We haven't even gotten to 2026 yet. And, you've heard they're talking about a 14, maybe even 16 team playoff in which the two of them are guaranteed 4 automatic berths each. And the timing of that coming off of the SEC getting 3 berths is, pretty notable. This is not something anybody wants. In fact, it's been interesting from that column how many of the comments were from Big Ten and SEC fans who don't want this because it's unnecessary. They're going to get that many teams in most years regardless. So it doesn't, just legislating it, all that really does is create a perception of an uneven playing field. And I think that really undermines the credibility of an event that's just getting off the ground.
Right. Well, and I wrote about this too, and I kind of took, I wouldn't say sympathetic. I basically said, if you strip away the automatic qualifiers, that's what we're getting anyway, right? You're going to get, I looked at it on my sheet here, if you take teams from the SEC and the Big Ten the last 2 years, you're looking at 10 teams, 8 teams, 6 teams, 7 teams. I actually went the angles like they could theoretically ask for more, but they didn't. Like in terms of if they were going to ask for 4 each, why not go for 5 each? Why not go for 6 each? Make it 75% of the field when you go Notre Dame. So I just think, do you think, I guess my question would be, if you strip away the automatic qualifiers, does that theory make sense for the next chapter of the college football playoff when we go to 14 or 16, which feels inevitable?
I think that, I've seen those numbers too. If you look at it kind of on the whole, like over a long period of time, it pretty much, matches up with what they're asking for. Right. But of course, it's not every year. And so the idea that whether the SEC let's use the Big Ten, has a great year or a bad year or in between, they're going to get the same number of bids. The Big 12 last year, you could say, would have been generous to give them 2 bids. They only got 1. Who's to say this year, under the current format, they don't get 3, right? So we're not, rather than letting the season play out and determining a field specific to that season, we're basically going to, before the season even starts, determine your conference is this and your conference is that. And it doesn't really matter, just fill in the names. It doesn't really matter how the teams actually play.
Right. We're saying Clemson, Miami, and Florida State aren't going to be good all in the same year.
Yeah.
Like, that's basically would be the case if Notre Dame took that at-large spot.
Sorry, we have a cat entering the picture here.
That's all right.
All right.
Here, I'll go off camera for a second.
All right. So yeah, I mean, if you had a 14-team playoff and Notre Dame made it, then you could not have 3 ACC teams. You could not have either Miami, Florida State, or Clemson, and who, tradition says the 3 of them could be good at the same time. And so that's really weird. How much of this do you think, Stu, is a response to the ACC keeping Alabama out of the playoff? Clemson kicking a 56-yard field goal on the last play of the game, and Alabama misses by 1 spot. If he misses the field goal and SMU wins in overtime, Alabama gets the 4th spot. Are we in the same spot if that didn't happen?
Yeah, it's interesting because when they first started talking about this at the meetings last year, it was really only Tony Petitti who was driving the conversation. Greg Sankey wasn't looking to talk about that, at least not this soon. And I think what happened with the committee last year, where they, anybody in the SEC would tell you pick any of Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss should have been in there instead of Indiana or instead of SMU, that the committee didn't reward them for playing a strong schedule. And I think that's why the SEC is on this now. Tony Petitti is a TV executive. All he cares about is what can make my conference more TV money. And, as we wrote about from the meeting yesterday, he's already got his eyes on this play-in tournament to those 4 automatic berths that he can then sell to Fox or CBS or whoever. I think for Sankey and for the SEC, it's about reducing the power that the committee has. If you do it this way, the committee would determine the seating order, but we get to determine who, we are assured our top 4 teams will be in, and it'll be off our conference standings, and it won't be the committee getting to decide this team went 11-1 and this team went 10-2, and it doesn't matter what schedules they played. We're taking the 11-1 team.
How do you rectify that, though? Because Stewart, the biggest annoyance for me was the first weekend of the playoff, which should have been a celebration of, hey, we've got these games on campus. My Twitter timeline, and probably yours, was Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss fan bases bitching while they're watching SMU get beat by 28 points. And I was thoroughly annoyed by the entire process of it. So how do you rectify that argument with the SEC where they say, we have a 9-3 team that weighs more than a 10-2 ACC team, whereas, versus the games actually mattering and Alabama being penalized for losing to Oklahoma?
Right, which is, in this proposal they're making, that wouldn't matter, right? That they lost 27-3 to Oklahoma. If they're in the top 4, they go. I do agree in general, and I think most people, if they kind of put the bias stuff aside, would say, yeah, the SEC is still the strongest conference in college football. Playing an SEC schedule is generally going to be tougher than any other. But last year in particular, those 3 teams were so they just weren't the right teams to be putting up for that case. Like, nobody felt, when Greg Byrne put out that thing about we may have to revisit who we play in the non-conference and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, that's not what cost you. Losing 27-3 to Oklahoma is what cost you. Ole Miss lost at home to Kentucky. You never hear Lane Kiffin mention that in his crusade. And I actually thought South Carolina was the best of the 3, but they had lost to them, so they couldn't leapfrog them. So you're always going to have, we have arguments in the NCAA tournament, right? Like, my 68th place team would have done better than this team. Like, you're never going to negate that. I'm a little puzzled why they've never, for all the frustration people in the sport have about the committee, why they've never revisited that model in the first place. Like, they crafted those criteria in 2012 for a 4-team playoff, and they've never revisited it. And if you think it's important that the committee prioritize strength of schedule above all else, put that in writing. Don't leave it up to them to decide. And I thought last year's committee, more than any I could remember, just totally disregarded it.
The best teams. It's just the best teams, right? I do. Yeah. I found it funny and hypocritical yesterday when the Big Ten and the SEC were like, "Oh, let's go with the committee's rankings for seeding."
Yeah.
Right. 1 through 12. We trust the committee. I mean, these are important seedings. If it's 1 through 12, We trust the committee to decide who's going to be 4 and 5, even though that's a big difference because 4 gets a bye, 5 doesn't. We trust them to determine who's 8, who's 9, because 8 gets the home game, 9 is on the road. But we don't trust them to put the field together because we want to stack it with the SEC. So which is it? Do you trust the committee or do you not trust the committee? These guys talk out of the both sides of their mouth, and everything that comes out of their mouth is eventually obviously going to benefit whatever benefits their conference is what's going to come out of their mouth.
How about Greg Sankey saying, he was asked if does he think about larger college football when he makes these decisions? And he said, if I was only cared about the SEC, we'd still be at 4.
Right.
Well,
no, you wouldn't.
Do you support that thing? I've got your mailbag open. I haven't read it yet, but should they seed it by the rankings? I'm a strong proponent of that. I think they should seed 1 to 12. Last year, if we do that, your 8-9 matchup would have been Boise and Indiana, which to me is amazing. That way, in your column this week, you said, part of this is we get to shine a light on Boise and Arizona State and Indiana. Well, to me, that's the best way to shine it. You play a first-round game that feels like that matchup to me would have felt like what you get in the NCAA tournament with a good 8-9 matchup. So should we seed it accordingly?
Yeah, to me, that's a no-brainer. And I know they said they want to try to do it as soon as this season. The bye, I enjoyed the playoff, but the byes were definitely off. The seedings were kind of manipulated when you think about it. Of course, the irony of that is the seedings will be manipulated if they go through with this. I mean, it'll probably let's say the Big Ten doesn't have a great year the first year that they do this, and it'll be the same exact complaint. Well, this 4th Big Ten team's ranked number 17, and the 3rd ACC team's ranked 12th. Why did we take the 17th team and not the 12th? Right, so you're just going to manipulate it another way.
Right, that's exactly right. And why do you think the push to 14, the push to 16 right off the bat? Like, why did they not want to let this thing play out a little bit? Is it just Petitti wants more inventory? Because I'm sort of hearing ESPN's not necessarily going to pay that much more, or if any more.
They don't
money.
Actually have to pay any more.
Yeah. So, what's the motivation behind trying to push it to 14 and 16?
Well, what you hear a lot is that this 12-team system was created before all the realignment happened, and they didn't go back to the drawing board even after all. So if you're Tony Petitti, you have an 18-team conference, and you're trying to keep all those people happy. You got a lot of programs in there that expect to go to the playoff regularly. So the more berths you can guarantee them, the better. I don't know if that's Sankey's rationale. They're at 16. I'm a little more confused about the SEC's motivation for this, but I think the Big Ten, got so big that 12 playoff berths is not enough for them. And so they're already pushing for more. And I think it reminds me of the old BCS days when every year they would change it to accommodate whatever that year's controversy was. And we have 8 computer rankings. No, now we have 3. And it made it very hard for the fans to follow it. And I think they're putting themselves in risk at that again.
Should there be, when we pick if it goes to 16, which I think we're ultimately going to get to, right? And I hope we don't expand after that. I hope we're done. 16, that's a good number to me. I don't know that we need 32 teams participating in a college football tournament. Should there be a computer element to complement or supplement what the committee is doing? I know, some people, we always see those stories. Here's what the BCS formula would have spit out for 12 teams. I know
that thing is bunk.
Right. Well,
that always gets a little traction, but some of the computer rankings, like the Harris poll, doesn't exist anymore, I don't think.
Right. Well, should we have some sort of strength of schedule computer element that instead of a subjective, hey, Alabama's better than, whoever went like Iowa in the Big Ten if they go 9-3.
I think the great thing about the basketball committee is that they do publicize the net rankings, and anybody with a computer knows where their team stands and how many quad 1 wins they have. It's all completely transparent. You might not agree with their decisions, but at least you know what the rationale was. I don't like that the College Football Committee operates in secrecy. We know there is a strength of schedule ranking that they look at. We don't know what it is. And so I think there's, the difference obviously is there's a much smaller data set in football, to the point where I don't know that you'd want to ride whether it's SP plus or FPI or whatever, and just be like, this is our Bible and this is what we're going by. But I think at the very least they owe the public transparency in terms of what numbers are you using, so we know, like, because a lot of times those computer rankings or those strength schedule rankings vary a lot, and Sagarin's might be completely different than ESPN's, but that's what people say. ESPN cites their own strength of schedule rankings on that playoff show, and yet that's not the rankings from what we've been told that the committee uses. So it's very confusing.
So that is interesting what you said about the BCS stories that they're not necessarily accurate or whatever, because if the BCS, whatever year you want to pick, that mirrors what we're coming up with now, what the committee has been coming up with over the last 10, 11 years. Like, I talked to Bender about this during the year or after the year. Like, I was so fed up with the complaining from the athletic directors and the coaches and the commissioners about the selection committee. It was so frustrating. And then I thought to myself, I said, look at the Big 12 standings. Okay. There was a 4-way tie for first place. Colorado and BYU did not get to go to the Big 12 championship game because of this complicated tiebreaker that people weren't totally sure what went into everything. And even Deion Sanders, who has the biggest megaphone in college football, wasn't out there stumping, complaining, this is unfair that we're not getting a chance to play for a CFP berth. People just kind of accepted that tiebreak and moved on. And then they got into the games and whatever. So I was like, wouldn't that be nice if people just moved on once we got the 12-team field, because it was spit out by a computer? Because, like I said, there was no debating the Big 12 tiebreaker. There was no debating, like, if we go through the 6-way tie for fourth place, people just accept the tiebreaker, even though they don't really understand it. So would a computer formula kind of take that away and people accept the computer formula? I don't know.
Yeah. I thought the conference tiebreakers were really frustrating last year, but you're right that, like, it just exposed, like, these conferences are way too big. The schedules are so unbalanced. But yeah, I mean, you didn't see like BYU fans screaming to the moon that they got left out of the Big 12 title game. It was like, well, here's the records, the common records. I remember there was the night that Alabama lost Oklahoma, like the SEC had to send out a press release that Georgia had made it. Like, you couldn't figure that out on your own. You needed to wait for them to tell you that it was official. But yeah, I mean,
there wasn't outrage. That was the funny part. There wasn't outrage. People just waited and found out.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the selection committee would save themselves a lot of trouble if they just said, these two teams, we have them the same spot, so we just went by the cumulative winning percentage of their opponents.
Yeah, I emailed. I remember one of those Saturdays I had to email Chuck Dunlap at the SEC. I was like, "Is this correct?" You know, because I was trying to figure it out on my own. And it was like, "What is this the exact scenario for?" Oh, it might have been Texas A&M. I can't remember. November was quite a blur. Conference championships, are they on the way out? I mean, is that a feasible scenario where, I mean, one of my contentions, it's not popular. I think we get rid of them and we go straight to the playoff like the NFL does. Go play the first round right away if we have a legit selection process. Because to me, I mean, I don't know about you, but I watched Oregon and Penn State and Texas, Georgia a little bit differently, because I thought, well, they're both in. You know, I know it impacted the seeding, but I still watched it differently than I may have done in the past.
I'm really surprised. I knew the Big Ten had their eye on this play-in tournament. I'm really surprised the SEC would do anything to impact the game in Atlanta. Like, that's their heart, their baby, right? The SEC championship is such a bigger deal to the fans in that conference than any of the others. And, I remember people saying, like, well, I know Georgia and Texas are both in. Why should I? Like, this game doesn't mean as much. And then, like, the TV ratings came out and it was enormous because it was a great game, went to overtime, and it does, as of now, at least, still matter if who wins the SEC because of the bye. So I'm really surprised they're thinking. I don't know, like, it may turn out a week from now or 2 weeks from now that this was all a leverage play of some sort. I hope it is. I hope that's what it turns out to. Do you guys want to watch? I'm curious, like, do you want to watch third place Michigan against sixth place Wisconsin to see who gets the fourth Big Ten playoff berth?
No. And I grew up in Big Ten country so my view, and Bill and I go back and forth on this a lot, it's very myopic because I grew up near Columbus, Ohio, where I'm still trying to do the math of how did Ohio State lose to Michigan and win a national title. And that math is still being calculated around here, believe me, because I'm at practice every night talking to dads about it, where this national championship, I can say definitively, probably feels a little bit differently than when they beat Miami and when they beat Oregon, because part of it's because of Michigan and part of it is they're still like, well, we went on an awesome run. So
Right.
which one is it?
And they're not going to make T-shirts in Columbus would have the schedule with the scores.
No, they can't.
Right?
They can't have it on the back. So my point is, I grew up without a Big Ten championship game and was fine. And I do understand. I talked to Chris Lowe about this once, where he was like, "You really think they're going to take the heart of what the SEC is all about with that championship game?" No. So that's where I struggle. Where I'm kind of like, and being an NFL guy too, I'm like, well, let's just put 16 in at the end of the regular season and go from there. And I've stuck with that. But I realize in order to do that, you have to find some way to recoup what you're losing from the conference championship games. And I don't have a good answer for that.
Yeah, the SEC championship is a big moneymaker. I don't know about the Big Ten. I mean, I would assume, I've never been to a Big Ten championship game. I would assume it varies greatly on who, like Oregon Penn State could not have brought a ton of fans last year. I don't know if that was true or not, but and so what I would do, I've been saying this for years. You remember in the COVID year, the Big Ten had, I thought was a great idea to do a Champions Week where they flexed the 9th game or whatever. I don't know how many games ended up being that year. And they were going to create matchups for the last week of the regular season based on standings. It didn't work out because like half the team, like Michigan had to, remember, like a lot of teams couldn't play that weekend.
Right.
Like I've said, like, okay, the Big Ten, you should schedule 8 of your conference games before the season and leave the 9th one open. See how the season plays out. It's kind of like a bracket busters idea, right? Like, and then on the last weekend of the season, the top 2 play for the championship, and then 3 plays 4 and 5, and it's and just to give those teams like another chance at a big win. That's different to me than saying shoehorning that in to say the winners of this 3 versus 6 game is definitely going to go to the playoff.
And then the ACC is talking about having 2 versus 3.
These people, I've never seen them overreact so much to one season. It used to be the opposite. Like every year, the fans would complain about the BCS and how awful the BCS was, and Jim Delaney would come out and say, like, well, we're not changing it. Just deal with it. And the fans are not the ones driving this. Like, I do think there was a lot of, understandable about the seeding and the buys and all that, but like nobody came off of last season being like, what we could really use that would make this a lot better. Get rid of the conference championship games, have the lower seeded teams play each other. Like this is a solution looking for a problem.
Right. I agree with that. What do you think the chances are that they do fix the seeding? Because I don't see any motivation for the Big 12 or the ACC or the Group of 5 to agree to this.
Yeah.
Other than Big 10 and SEC negotiating for, well, if you do this for 2025, we'll give you this for 2026 since we're in charge. That's, like you said, a potential leverage play. I don't know what they could be bargaining for or not for, but like to me, the seeding is not going to get fixed. It makes no sense for those 3 entities to agree to it.
It's going to happen in 2026. It's when they don't need the unanimity. So it's just a matter of whether the Big 12 ACC would say, all right, even though this worked to our benefit last year, we know this is coming. We'll just sign up for it a year early. But to your point, there isn't a lot of real incentive for them to do that, especially if the Big 10 and SEC are just going to keep plowing ahead with their plans. But there were 2 main, correct me if I'm wrong, there were 2 main complaints last year. That was one. And the other was there should be more campus games. Like, why don't we play the quarterfinals on campus too? That's the one that's not going to get addressed for a long time. There's no urgency by them to minimize the bowls at all. But I think the seeding one will happen at least by 26.
Well, and then I think, if I'm the Big 10 and SEC and that, I'm not making you agree to it, but I would be the first to point out that, the Big 12's won 1 playoff game in 11 years. The ACC's had 1 team win a playoff game in 11 years. And granted, Clemson won a bunch, but at a certain point, you got to win. And I get it. We were 1 year in on a 12-year format, but
Yeah.
or 11-year format. I apologize. The other complaint I would have, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and some of it is born out of a sports writer mentality that you're covering the sport as long and hard as you do, is the playoff too long? Do they need to? That's kind of one of my solutions is let's go right away. Let's play the first 2 rounds right away. Take a break semis, take a break title game, and get out of the NFL's way. Because the point I was making was, I'm sitting there in Atlanta having breakfast Monday before Notre Dame, Ohio State, which where I'm growing up, that's like the biggest possible game you can have. And on the TV, they're talking about Baltimore and Buffalo and Philadelphia and whoever. Do they fast track, push it up, and get out of the NFL's way? Is that feasible? Is that something they should do?
If you said to me you can make one change to college football, but only one, it would be to move week 1 to what is currently week 0, move the whole thing up a week, start the playoffs a week earlier so that it ends the same time it used to. Because you could play the first round, what is currently Army-Navy week. You could play the quarters, what is currently the first round, and then have your semis on New Year's and your championship game a week later like you used to, because there's no question it dragged on too long. It felt like the longest season on earth to me. And I think the TV rating for the championship game reflected that, because like you said, Bill, it's Ohio State, Notre Dame. Like, it's a TV executive's dream. And it was down from Michigan, Washington last year. So I think some people tuned out.
Yeah, it's just too much conflict with the NFL. Way too much conflict.
Yeah.
I would back up the season 2 weeks, honestly. And it gives you another weekend on the weekend on the front end.
Fry an egg on the metal bleachers at some of those SEC stadiums if you're playing in August.
They'll sit through it.
Yeah.
I mean, you get another weekend to yourself on the front end.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
NFL conflicts. And I know it's hot.
That's the great thing about Labor Day weekend is they have no competition with the NFL. They can play on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Let's do 2 weeks of that.
Right. Exactly. I totally agree with that. All right. Well, let's get back to the Trocchi trivia question. Then we'll let you get out of here and figure out exactly what's going to happen in New Orleans and then in Dallas for next week. Let's go to the trivia question. Can you name the 6 teams that tied for 4th place in the SEC? Stu, I'll let you name a team, and then I'll let Bill name a team, and we'll go back.
Oh, it's like a team effort?
Yeah, we do like the tag team.
Okay.
So I'll probably screw us over here.
I remember the LSU was one of them.
LSU was correct. They all went 5-3. So LSU is correct.
I need a team with 3 SEC losses.
Yeah.
That's got to be Alabama.
Alabama is correct. One of 6.
Ole Miss.
Ole Miss, correct.
All right, now I'm gonna cost us. South Carolina lost 3, correct?
South Carolina is correct. There's 2 left.
A&M.
Texas A&M is correct.
Oh, now the hard one.
It's up to you, Bill.
That was who I had as my answer.
You can have a clean sweep.
It's not Kentucky. It's not. Hold on. Give me 2 seconds.
So so we know, 1st and 2nd were Georgia, Texas.
Yeah. So give me those out of the way. I think I have it. Is it Missouri?
Missouri. You are correct. That was the 6-way tie for 4th place.
Who was 3rd
in the SEC? Tennessee, right?
Oh yeah, Tennessee.
Tennessee finished 6-2 or 7-2, 6-2. But hey, we got them. That's good teamwork. So right down the line. The pressure was on there. I felt a lot of pressure there.
Well done. Teamwork. Well done.
So that'll be the next, you can see where that would be the next controversy is like Missouri gets left out of that. And they're like, what the heck? We deserve to play for the playoff just as much as these 5 other 5-3 teams.
Right. Or people just accept the tiebreak for whatever reason. They just blindly accept it.
We do it in the NFL all the time. We just, that's the funny thing real quick. And then I'll be done is like, as a Green Bay fan, you were like, well, we had this record but we were in this really tough NFC North division where Detroit and Minnesota won like 14 games each, but you just blindly accept, road Philadelphia. It's cool. And then you lose and your season's over and you move on with your life. So maybe it's just a couple more years of that where we have defined criteria like Stewart was talking about.
I think Bill's actually struck gold here. There's 2 of you, Bill Trocchi. What would stop college football from lining up all, I'm going to assume the 10 and let's just assume the 10-2 teams all get in, and now there's 2 spots left. What's to stop them from lining up all the 9-3 teams, even the group of 5 ones, calculating their cumulative winning percentage, like they do with wasn't the RPI 2/3,
right?
2/3, and just saying, okay, well, these were the 2 that had the best. These were the 2 teams that had the toughest schedules. They get in, and all the other 9-3 teams get left out.
Right. If you're serious about eliminating subjectivity, you got to go to a formula, and the fallacy of this whole top 4 teams in the Big Ten, SEC, whatever. It's just like the standings don't reflect who are the best teams because they don't play each other. You can't compare it to the NFL because they play everyone in their division twice, and it's decided on the field. These obviously conferences are too big. Nobody played. The schedules are very unequal, and that's not going to work. And we're having 6-way ties, and we're having 4-way ties for first. And
wouldn't it also encourage people to schedule tough out of conference? Because you could do what Michigan was doing for those couple of years and schedule 4 nobodies. But if you end up in that tie,
your opponent's winning percent, right? Yeah. So that's another whole piece of it. Is like they want to do this Big Ten SEC challenge to get more TV inventory, but and have it. They want it risk free. They don't want any risk involved, and so everybody will do that. And it's like just
so compete. Those become exhibition games.
Don't be afraid to compete. Well, what are we doing? We're afraid to compete. The SEC and the
top 4 teams are in no matter what, and you're winning or losing your week 2 game, like the Ohio State Texas game. If that doesn't count against your playoff standing, what is it? It's in a preseason game.
Exactly. Very true. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, Stu. That was really fun, and that was really informative for our audience. Thank you to everyone for listening to the CFB Nation All-America podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you to Irish Breakdown, your source for Notre Dame football information. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you soon.